For years, Cristiano Ronaldo and Karim Benzema formed one of the best duos in world soccer at the Real Madrid Football Club. Time passes, and these days, they are rivals. But keep in mind, and here's the important thing, they are not in any major European league, but rather in the Saudi Arabian League. Yes, that league does exist. Cristiano plays for Al Nassr, and Benzema for Al Ittihad. And yes, I know many, if not the vast majority of you, may have never have heard of these two teams that are now making a name for themselves. And believe me, they are. Because don't think for a second that they were cheap signings. Want proof? Well, just take a look.
Cristiano Ronaldo completes $75 million per year move to Saudi club. Vision that Al Nassr has is inspiring.
In other words, Cristiano and Benzema went from scoring goals for Real Madrid to scoring their own stash of petrodollars. Visualeconomik community, the Saudis are pulling out the checkbook like there's no tomorrow. Neymar, Maine, Kante, and Henderson are just some of the stars that complete the latest Saudi acquisitions. In the summer of 2023 alone, Saudi teams spent almost $500 million, making their league one of the most important in the world, at least if we're talking about money. And this is not even exclusively about soccer. With golf or Formula One, among many other sports and shows, we can see a very similar situation.
Jon Rahm accepts the offer of $500 million from Saudi Arabia and will sign for the LIV golf circuit. The Spanish golfer scores a coup and signs the best contract in the history of the sport. Jon Rahm handed Saudi private jet and 10 staff as part of £450 million LIV golf deal.
What was until recently one of the most closed, opaque, and hostile countries in the world is now attempting a 180-degree turnaround. For example, while up until just a few years ago, music in public places and cinemas was practically forbidden, today we can see how large techno concerts and film festivals are organized in Riyadh. The unthinkable has even happened. The Saudi government has started to sell the jewel in the crown little by little, the great driver of the Saudi economy and the great source of public revenues. I am, of course, talking about Saudi Aramco, the largest oil company in the world, a company that the government itself nationalized in the 1970s. A giant value today at more than $2 trillion. Well, at the end of 2019, the Arab government sold a stake for about $25 billion. That was 5% of the company. Now, it is rumored in the markets that they are going to sell off another $50 billion. In other words, that they are gradually getting rid of their golden goose. It's a bit like France selling off the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, and the Arc de Triomphe in a single stroke. And okay, I know what many of you are thinking. Why are you surprised, Josh? All this is just another eccentricity of sheikhs used to swimming in gold, dollars, and riches of all kinds. Everybody knows that. It's the miracle of black gold. Well, maybe in part yes, but not really. At least not in the way many of you think. Because it's true that Saudi Arabia is a very oil-rich country, but unlike the Emirates or Qatar, it is not a country that is anywhere near as wealthy as its neighbors. In fact, for many, with a GDP per capita of just over $20,000, it would not even be considered a rich country. And that's because it's not. Basically because although it has a lot more resources than its neighbors, it also has a much larger population. In fact, its population has grown tremendously in recent decades, in such a way that what they could afford before, when practically the whole country lived on the profits of black gold, is no longer possible today. Simply and plainly, no matter how much oil they have, it is not enough. They cannot afford it. You see, Saudi Arabia has a population of about 37 million inhabitants, almost 4 times higher than in the 80s. In fact, as you can see in this graph, in base 100, the Saudi population has grown at a much faster rate than that of the world, or that of countries like the United States or Spain. We are talking about a gigantic change for the Arab country's society and economy. But in order to understand it better, let's look at some data. In recent years, Saudi Arabia has been producing between 9 and 12 million barrels per day. That's between a quarter and a third of a barrel of oil per capita. And if we exclude foreigners and only take into account citizens with Saudi nationality, who, at the end of the day, are really the ones with social rights, then we are talking about 0.4 barrels per head. In contrast, Kuwait, for example, produces much less, 2.5 million barrels per day. But in per capita terms, we are talking about almost twice as much, 0.55 0.5 barrels per inhabitant. And if we only take into account the population with Kuwaiti nationality, then we are talking about more than 1.7 barrels per head. In other words, 4 times the Saudi production. And in the Emirates and Qatar, it is practically the same with oil and gas. Visualeconomik community, this is exactly what explains why black gold is no longer enough to feed the entire economic and social machinery of this country. But wait a minute, if they are not so rich, how on earth can they explain so much eccentricity? If they are not such a wealthy country, how can they spend gigantic sums of money to sign Cristiano Ronaldo, buy Premier League football club Newcastle, or host Formula 1 tournaments? Well, here comes the most interesting part of all. None of what we have seen is a coincidence. Neither the signing of Cristiano Ronaldo, nor the techno festivals, nor the progressive sale of Saudi Aramco are coincidental. They might even make sense. And behind all these gambles is the plan devised by Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of the country, to try to overcome the country's serious economic problems. It is known as Vision 2030. We have talked about it over on Visualpolitik. It's a plan that has left such eye-catching headlines as this one.
Crown Prince. Saudi Arabia is making in Neom the new civilization of tomorrow.
Now, step on the brakes because this is Visualeconomik. In this video, we are not going to focus on the gigantic and fantastic projects that every now and then grab the attention of the media. No, in this case, what we want to tell you is what is behind this great plan, what exactly it hopes to achieve, and what consequences it is already having. So, let's get on with it. But before we continue, it's crucial to address a growing concern: the unauthorized sale of personal information online. This trend is escalating, with an increasing number of personal records being exposed. The 2022 Identity Theft Resource Center's annual data breach report reveals a staggering 41.5% rise in affected individuals compared to the previous year. This situation warrants attention, as the misuse of consumer data by scammers can lead to financial theft or identity impersonation. However, it's not a cause for immediate alarm. You possess the power to safeguard your privacy by requesting data brokers to erase your information. The issue lies in the time-consuming nature of this task if done individually. Fortunately, there is a practical solution at hand. Our sponsor, Enquiries, offers an efficient 3-step method to address this problem. Create an account and tell Enquiries whose personal data they'll be removing. Grant Enquiries the rights to work for you. They'll contact the data brokers and request the deletion of your personal data. Sit back, relax, and Enquiries will handle any objections and keep you updated on their progress every step of the way. Take your personal data back with Enquiries. Use code ECONOMICEN at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Don't miss this chance to protect your privacy. And now, let's start. The Saudi economy has 3 major problems, practically its own trilogy of Hollywood dramas, but without the special effects and happy ending. In a moment, you will understand why I say this. First, as we have already seen, the population has grown so much that the Saudis can no longer aspire to live on oil revenues, at least not entirely. It is no longer enough. We have already told you why, but that's not all. On top of that, their oil influence is starting to collapse. Why? Well, you'll see. For practically the last 50 years, since the 1973 oil crisis, OPEC has always imposed the rules on the global crude oil market. Basically, like all cartels, OPEC consisted of a union of major producers to limit production and drive prices up to the point necessary to maximize their profits. However, in recent years, crude oil production has soared in non-OPEC countries, such as the United States and Brazil. The result? OPEC has lost market share and thus influence on the international market. Precisely to try to solve this, OPEC Plus was invented, where most notably Russia has been included. Even so, fracking is making even that not enough, especially when some member countries want to produce as much bubbly black gold as possible for one simple and straightforward reason: they need money. They are typically very oil-dependent economies, so the incentive to skip agreed production is on the table.
Russia drives oil prices down. It does not respect the cuts approved in OPEC Plus by selling under the table.
Well, all this explains why OPEC has less and less influence these days. But that's not even the end of it. To complicate things even more, of all the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia was considered the major player. Not only because it had the highest production, but above all, because it was considered to be the only country capable of increasing or cutting production by large amounts in a very short time. In other words, it was the key player in the world's energy policy. But Visualeconomik viewers, now all that has changed. Saudi Arabia appears to be playing at the limit of its capacity, and another major producer has completely overtaken it. Of course, I am talking about the United States, a country which, thanks to fracking, has once again become the world's largest crude oil producer by far. Now, if the price of oil rises, American producers start extracting black gold at full speed. In fact, this is precisely what has happened in recent times. Thus, although OPEC, especially Saudi Arabia, has cut its production from mid-2022, oil prices have remained relatively stable and even declined in recent months. In other words, the Saudis can no longer control global prices. This will ultimately severely limit their ability to generate extra profits. In fact, Saudi Arabia's policy of production cuts since 2022 has been a complete disaster. They failed to raise prices or even keep them stable. It is clear to see that as the US has increased production, the price has continued to fall. Take a look. To make matters worse, by producing less, Riyadh has naturally reduced its revenue as well. And of course, in an economy so absolutely dependent on crude oil, that creates a very difficult scenario. For example, the Saudi economy has entered recession, and it has done so with force, at an annualized rate of 4.5% by the end of 2023.
Saudi Arabia's oil production cuts have tipped its economy into reverse.
Think about it. Oil accounts for 40% of the entire economy and approximately 70% of all public revenues. So you can imagine the problem if both production and prices fall. Worse still, the threat is that things will get even more dire in the future. And that's without taking into account the energy transition plans of the richest countries. The result? Saudi Arabia's traditional energy, economic, and even political influence is in danger of soon becoming history. Yes, we can say it loud and clear. Fracking has dealt a huge blow to the sheikhs of the Middle East. It has been a real kick in the pants. Because also, and this brings us directly to the third problem, Saudi Arabia's economy is a disaster. We are talking about a country that has seen virtually zero GDP growth per capita over the last 30 years. In other words, in the last 3 decades, despite the fact that the world has become richer at full speed, this country has remained frozen. In 2021, its GDP per capita was practically the same as in 1991. And although in 2022 things improved slightly, 2023 was again a rather bad year, and the country ended up in recession. To top it off, more than half of its population is under 35 years old. And what's wrong with that, you may ask? Well, until now, the country was used to living off oil, but since that is no longer possible, they now have to make do with an economy that is less and less rich in the international rankings. And that means 3 things: fewer opportunities, less income, and a lot of frustration, which in the long run may end up causing a political shakeup. Well, in order to avoid this, in 2016, the de facto leader and heir to the throne, Mohammed bin Salman, presented a mega plan, the Vision 2030 plan, a pharaonic strategy to change the country from top to bottom in just a few years. After a slow start, and then the COVID-19 crisis, that plan is currently being rolled out at full speed. We're talking about the Saudi government expecting to spend some $3 trillion to transform and modernize its economy by 2030. In just a decade, the country aims to become a world center for high technology and a preferred destination for wealthy tourists and business travelers. In other words, it aims to do in fewer than 10 years what Dubai has managed to do in almost 50. And this is exactly what explains why every now and then we come across announcements of large, pharaonic, and unmanageable projects, such as NEOM, a new futuristic city in which the government expects to invest some $500 billion and which will be powered by renewable energy. Or Sindalaha, an artificial island with large marinas, futuristic golf courses, and super luxury hotels and stores. An exclusive macro resort for the international elite. And take note, because both projects, however fanciful they may seem to us, are already underway. Visualeconomik community, Saudi Arabia wants to get rid of its dependence on oil, and for that, the government is willing to do 3 things. 1. Sell part of its crude oil production by partially privatizing Saudi Aramco. 2. do use part of that money to invest in global companies. That is, to create a huge sovereign wealth fund to replace the oil position with investments in sectors with more capacity for growth, while influencing these companies to set up in the country. For example, so far, they have invested more than $40 billion in a lot of gaming and video game companies around the world. Barrels of oil for Electronic Arts Sports 2024 licenses. Don't tell me you don't find that surprising. And thirdly, the government wants to use the other part of all of its money and all the revenue it gets from the partial privatization of the oil industry to fuel and boost business investment and projects of all kinds at home. Take, for example, the development of the futuristic NEOM, the construction of giant solar energy production parks, or the financing of venture capital funds to finance local startups. This is the case of STV, the largest venture capital fund in the Middle East, which is financed by the government. And here, let me insist, we are not only talking about projects as spectacular as NEOM, but others much more realistic. For example, they are building a new macro airport in Riyadh with capacity for 120 million passengers per year, and they are setting up a huge new airline, Riyadh Air, which many of you may already be familiar with due to its sponsorship of Atletico Madrid, despite the fact that it is not expected to operate until 2025. It is set to be the new Emirates of Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, more and more international companies are looking at this market, and logically, government dollars have a lot to do with this. Thus, Lucid Motors, a potential rival of Tesla, has started to manufacture electric cars in Saudi Arabia. Oracle has announced a $1.5 billion investment. The Hilton chain expects to open 50 new hotels, and Microsoft is investing $2 billion. And that is saying a lot in a country where, up until now, foreign investment accounted for barely 1% of GDP. Saudi Arabia has traditionally been a closed ground for foreign investment. And naturally, it's not all about money. This plan, the Vision 2030 plan, also includes other measures, such as eliminating many of the strict social norms that used to govern life in the country, promoting the arrival of foreign investors, and reducing its suffocating and slow bureaucracy. They are also forcing multinationals to install their regional headquarters here if they want to aspire to win government contracts. What's more, Riyadh is also encouraging many dirty industries that are being driven out of the United States, and above all, Europe, to set up shop here. We are talking about a mammoth effort.
No one believes me when I tell them what is happening in this country. It's rare in emerging markets that we see a country with such an aggressive plan, trying to achieve things that countries have done over 15 to 20 years within a shorter period of time. Oldenburg, head of emerging markets equities at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. This is a sea change in the region. The litmus test of reform will be if they attract foreign investment. It will take a few years to test, but this is the biggest economic experiment we have seen in a long time.
We are talking, as you can see, about an unprecedented experiment. No country has ever tried to transform itself so quickly. Of course, as we shall also see, there is another side to all this. But for now, we have one question pending. What on earth does this have to do with all the multi-million-dollar investments in sports that we discussed at the beginning of this video? Well, a lot. It has a lot to do with it. For Riyadh, sport is one of the wild cards it's using to clean up its image worldwide. If you want to attract tourists, businesses, and investments, you generally need a good reputation. And that is precisely what this country does not have. And here, sports investments play an absolutely key role in raising the country's profile, rebranding, and rebranding. For example, in addition to the major signings mentioned before, the country is also organizing major tournaments, such as the 2034 World Cup and Asian Games, the 2027 Asian Cup, the Club World Cup, and the Spanish and Italian Super Cups. It is even preparing a project to try to win the 2036 Olympic Games. And so it goes. But just a moment, because as we told you earlier, the Pharaonic Vision 2030 plan also has another face. And here we are not only referring to its abysmal human rights record, or the fact that repression and social surveillance have not only been reduced, but have actually increased. No, we're talking about a very large project. One so large that they may only get a single shot to make it happen. Let me explain. The Vision 2030 plan entails huge, gigantic investments that promise to consume most of the Saudi state's resources. And if we also factor in that its accounts are in the red, this bet could be an all-or-nothing gamble. If Mohammed bin Salman's plan works, Saudi Arabia could overcome much of its dependence on crude oil and escape its chronic economic stagnation. However, if it doesn't work, in a few years, the country could be in serious economic and social trouble. And you know that governments are not particularly good at designing and directing business initiatives. Although we have also seen how, in the case of Arab countries, there are some exceptions. The question is, will this be one of those exceptions? And will the Vision 2030 plan succeed in getting Saudi Arabia to diversify its economy and overcome both its dependence on crude oil and the economic stagnation it has suffered over the past 30 years? Tell us what you think in the comments, and let's start a debate. And of course, if you found the video interesting, then don't forget to like and subscribe to Visualeconomik if you haven't already done so. Thank you so much for watching, all the best, see you next time.